go. Okay, could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Lynn Harrell. I'm moved to Charlotte County, actually Punta Gorda, when I was 5 years old in 1958. And I have been studying history for over 45 years now. I am often described as a historian. I'm not comfortable with that. I consider myself a historian by happenstance. And I would be pleased to help with this project and answer any questions that I can.
Could you describe some of just your earliest memories in Punta Gorda?
Well, the first place that we moved to was, well, we came here because my mother was transferred with the Belk Lindsay Company, and they were opening a new department store here in Punta Gorda. And they came down, she and the store manager were the only Belk's employees. They were from the Sarasota store who were being transferred. All the other people were to be hired locally. Mm-hmm. And they came down to see what the status of the shopping center was and all that. And she saw a for rent sign in the window of an old house, scribbled down the number, and because that was, a big thing was like, well, where are we going to live? And and she called, and so she never saw the inside. She only saw the one side that they drove by. And but by the time Dad got home from work, she'd sent the owner a check. She was so, took care of that. And anyway, so when we came to see the house, which was, I think, the weekend before the week we were going to move in, I was only like 5 years old, but I do remember Dad, 3 words that I remember. One is unsuitable. The other is the traffic, and it was on Cross Street, which was very busy even back then, and that was decades before it became southbound US 41. And the third was, where's the church? Because my oldest sister was engaged to be married, and her fiance was Catholic, and she had gone through, all of the training or whatever. We were Methodists, so and it turns out that was Mother's crown jewel of, the perfection there was because we were only a block and a half away from Sacred Heart Church, and she'd already talked to the priest. So we moved to Punta Gorda. But Dad found another place just within a few months. And it was not that far away, actually maybe 8 blocks, 10 at the most, and on Olympia Ave, and the first house was on Virginia, so it was a block over and about 8 blocks down. And it was an amazing house, and it had been built in the 20s. Of course, I didn't know this then, and now I can tell you the whole history. I've researched for years. But it was called Walled Garden, and it took up pretty much half a city block. The part where the house and grounds were took up about a quarter of the block, and there was a 6-foot tall red brick fence around, the main building, the house, and the grounds, which it was actually a botanical garden, and there were statues and fountains, and the house itself had just amazing, detail. I remember the light switches in the living room, or the main room when you went in, and they were brass plates or plaques about the size of the lid of a shoebox, and they had push button switches with mother of pearl caps. And the back plate itself had scroll work, in it of grape leaves and vines, and they were just absolutely gorgeous. anyway, there was that kind of detail. And of course, I had never seen anything like that. I also didn't realize that everyone didn't live in houses like that. But it turns out that the hospital had bought the property and with an eye to expansion. So it was slated for demolition. But they didn't want anybody breaking in, so they had been, renting it out. And we had amazing times there, my sister and I. Our oldest sister, of course, she had married, moved to St. Pete. But one of the wonderful things that I remember about it was kitty corner to it was like an old craftsman bungalow type. And there was a retired lady that lived there that I made friends with. Her name was Miss Sally. And we used to have long discussions, and I should probably mention that I could already read. I was reading by the time I was 3 years old. And my grandmother taught me, and she didn't teach me on kids' books. We read whatever Grandma was reading because I was sitting on her lap. Because I remember Miss Sally once asking me, who my favorites were, and I was thinking, and she says, "Well, do you like Dr. Seuss?" I said, "No, he's silly." And she said, "Well, who do you like?" I said, "Well, I like Mary Roberts Reinhardt." Agatha Christie. I said, "Zane Grey, not so much." At any rate, it was only when I read her obituary in the paper some months later that I realized that my friend Miss Sally was actually Sally Jones, who was a retired teacher and I guess the first female superintendent of schools in the state or something. And, I'd had no idea. She was just Miss Sally.
Well, growing up, where did you go to school?
I went to Sally Jones. Well, actually, we got fouled up to start with. I had already started school in Bradenton. But when we moved to Punta Gorda, Sally Jones was a new school, but it was already overcrowded. and Mom had called to register, my sister Marla. But Marla, being a little older, she was going to what they called the little school, which was over on Taylor. And it had like 4th, 5th, and 6th grades, I think. And in fact, that was, last year that they used the little school because it burned down. At any rate, but when she called Sally Jones, they asked, she didn't say, it was a transfer. She just said she wanted to register her daughter, in 1st grade, and it was like, well, when's her birthday? And Mom said when my birthday was, which was January 15th. She said, well, is she 6 already? Oh, no, she'll be 6 in January. And, oh, no, well, then, sorry, you're out of luck. And so Mom, they're getting the store opened. They're, Dad's looking for a job. Okay. So she didn't bother about it until a few weeks later, my grandparents came to visit, and of course, Grandma had a vested interest in my schooling, and when she asked me, she said, "Well, how do you like the new school?" I said, "I'm not going to school." I was like, "What?" And she hollered for my mom, "Leela!" And then I had to leave the room while they had a discussion. So I went into the butler's pantry where I could overhear everything they said. And Mom explained, well, she did try, but, I was just going to have to wait it out. And so Grandma came out, and she was not happy. And so they were going to stay for about a week. And on Monday, when they'd come on the weekend, when Mom went off to work at Belk's and Dad went off, looking for a job, Grandma came in and she says, "Come on, get up. We got to get dressed. We got to, whatever." And she put me in one of my nice little dresses, and I'm thinking, and we went down to the school. And we just breezed in, and she said, I'm here to transfer my granddaughter. She was at Orangewood Elementary in Bradenton. The transcripts will follow. You know, and they're looking at me. I'm a little pint-sized kid, and it's like, well, when's her birthday? You know, January 1st. I think I was in 6th grade before I found out I wasn't a New Year's baby. But then walking to school was weird because I had made friends in the neighborhood. Walled Gardens was at the corner of Booth Street and East Olympia. There were a lot more big, beautiful homes on the east side than there are these days. And so most of the children that I had met, apart from the Heinemans, who lived across Booth Street from us, you know, they were black children, and that was fine with me. I had, but when them walking to school, I thought it was terribly unfair because they would stop, you know, a block and a half away at Baker Academy, and I had to keep trudging on another 2-3 blocks to Sally Jones, and that just seemed, you know, not good. But I've got to say about Belk Lindsay, the manager, Bob Davis, he kind of bucked the norm. I didn't know this at the time, but he felt, even though Belk's was a big chain, they were based in Charlotte, North Carolina, he felt it should be a neighborhood store and it should reflect the neighborhood. Well, it was on the east side, which was primarily black. So the man that he hired to be, you know, the manager of the stockroom was John Henry Allen. There's a gallery named for him at the Blanchard House. And John had, for years after he got out of the service, he wanted to go to work at the post office, you know, fabulous benefits, you know, all of that. And every year when they gave the civil service examinations, John would, you know, I didn't know this then, but he would go and take the test. He would score very high. The, you know, local version says the highest, which is very possible. He was a very intelligent man. Mm-hmm. And the postmaster would never, no way. John was the wrong color, you know. And but Bob Davis, I mean, he saw, you know, quality worker when, when he applied, and man, he snapped him up. But every year he would give John the day off because whatever day the civil service exams fell on, so that he could go try again. And you know, and it didn't happen until years later when they finally got a different postmaster. But the weird thing is I don't know how far back to go. Let me just kind of skip ahead. After my grandparents went back to Bradenton, they did eventually, within the year, move here to Punta Gorda, but they needed someone, you know, to keep an eye on. Well, Dad did, you know, he found work, so they needed someone to keep an eye on me and my sister, Marla. And Marla was older, but not old enough for the two of us to be left on our own. And so Mom found you know, of course she knew enough not to say, "This is your babysitter." That's not, I'm not a baby. You know, she says, she says, "This is Antoinette." She was a young black woman, very sweet, you know, and it was basically she was there to keep an eye on us. Usually if there were breakfast dishes or something, you know, she'd do up the dishes and all that, but she actually wasn't like a housekeeper type thing. She was just there to kind of keep us company. She usually did her homework. And I didn't know that I mean, so when I would introduce her as my Aunt Annette, I thought she was a family relation. And people would look at me strange as a little strawberry blonde, freckled, scrawny kid. Yes, this is my Aunt Annette, this, very nice, dark-skinned young woman. And Antoinette, she never corrected me or anything. I think she got kind of a kick out of it too. And it wasn't until, I don't know, a few months down the line, and she had something was delivered to the house and she had to sign for it. And of course, I could already read. And she signed her name Antoinette. And I thought, So when Mom got home, I said, "Why is her name not pronounced Antoinette?" I'd heard of Marie Antoinette, and Mother said, "Well, I don't know." And she said, "Ask Carrie." Well, Carrie Hart was, kind of a housekeeper, and in fact, until she had gotten a full-time job, she'd been popping in and out and checking on us. And Carrie and Earl Hart, they're a great couple, and they would, and Earl he was a handyman type, and he had he had leased some farmland and put in watermelon, but when Carrie had to go help in the fields when the watermelon started ripening up. Well, at that point, let's see, my sister in St. Pete, and we were no longer at Walled Gardens at this time, but the friends that we made then, we had bonded with, and they, at any rate, Mom had called. Well, my oldest sister by then had 2 kids. Julie was the older, and then Duke, my nephew, he was a toddler, and Julie was in school, but she needed someone to watch Duke, because when Tony got divorced, she moved back here to Punta Gorda. So Mom had called Carrie, and Carrie said, "Well, can I take him out to the fields because the watermelon are in? We got to go." "Oh, sure." So there's my 3-year-old. That poor kid got sunburned like you wouldn't believe, out there in a diaper and a t-shirt and a straw hat. And he still, when he eats cucumbers, he gets a salt shaker and his pocket knife out, and he peels it, and he eats it like a banana, and salting it as he goes. And when he wants to split a watermelon, he picks it up longwise and drops it, and if you drop it on the stem end, it'll split right in half. And anyway, the things you learned out in the field. But so that John Allen, let me back up to the Walled Garden days. I was not really a sickly kid, but when I got upset, I had stomach issues. Basically, if I got upset, I'd barf, and I got upset one afternoon, and so I got sent to the nurse's office, and the nurse, she calls my mother, and Mother couldn't leave the store. And this was before Dad had found, his own work. So he had been working part-time with John Allen, marking stock and, all that. And so Mother said, well, she couldn't come down and get me, but she would send my dad. And I thought, okay, that works, whatever. And about 15 minutes later, Mrs. Rice, who was the school secretary at Sally Jones, she came in, and she did not say a word to me. She just kind of crooked her finger with a "come here" kind of thing. So I thought, okay. I get up, I follow her to the office. We go in, open the door to the office. And who was standing there but John Allen? And well, I had started out calling him Mr. Allen, and he said, "No, just call me John." And then my grandma heard me refer to him as John. She said, "You cannot call a grown man by his first name." And I said, "But you said I could." "Well, then you call him Mr. John." And so I called him Mr. John, and he laughed. And he said, "You don't have to call me Mr. John." I said, "Yes, I do." And then when I said to my grandmother, I said, "He doesn't want me to call him Mr. John." Says, "Well, then call him Mr. John Allen." So from then on to me, he was Mr. John Allen. So what do I tell Mrs. Rice? Because she's got this look on her face like something really strange is going on. And I kind of trotted over, and I'm about, I don't, not even hip high on him, So a little above, he was a little over 6 feet, I think. And I haven't even hit, 3 foot at that point, I don't think. But anyway, so I grab him around the knee. And because I'm so afraid they're not going to let me go with him, And I'm telling Mrs. Rice and Miss Moore, Ruth Moore was the principal, because she'd come out to see what was going on, and I'm saying, it's okay. Mr. John Allen is my other daddy. And it was, the jaw dropped. And John started laughing. He couldn't help it. And he says, "Come on, little miss, let's go." And we walked out, and I'm basically pushing him out the door. I was so afraid they're going to come after us. And he laughed all the way to Belk Lindsay. And years later, of course, I'm all grown up. This was after the Blanchard House had opened, and I'm active with the Punta Gorda Historical Society and all that. And I used to go to the Blanchard House events, and whenever John was there, he got the biggest kick out of telling that story, because when I would go up, and we'd hug, and he would introduce me, he says, "This is Lynn Harrell. She's my other daughter." And it was kind of funny. So I had Antoinette and my other daddy, John Allen, and it was just, I don't know.
Were you ever treated as like an outsider by other white people for your close relationships with Black people?
Well, not really. But I was not. I mean, just the fact that I was a northerner, even though I only came down from Sarasota. The kids, most of the kids that went to Sally Jones, they were from old families here, and they were, I kind of had to pass I don't know whether you want to call it a skill test or something, because when even after my grandmother said, "Oh yeah, her birthday is January 1st," which was the cutoff date, and they were kind of skeptical, and that's when Grandma said, "And she can already read." "Oh, she can she?" "And I suppose you brought her favorite book, for her to read to us." And Grandma said, "Well, no. Was I supposed to do that?" Well, in the meantime, they had called Mrs. Englehart, who was the first grade teacher, and she had come into the office, and she came in, and they said, well, they would leave it up to Mrs. Englehart to decide. So Mrs. Englehart came in, and I immediately hid behind my grandmother. Oh my gosh, this woman, she was very tall and heavy set. And she obviously did not appreciate being called out of her classroom. She was, and I thought, oh my God, what am I getting into? I was terrified. And then she smiled, and it would melt your heart. I mean, she was just, and she actually got down on one knee, so she was at my level, and introduced herself. And she said, "I hear you can read." And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And, hey, my grandma was standing there. My manners were, yeah. And she pulled a magazine off, a bookshelf behind us, and it was some teacher magazine kind of thing, you know, for educators. And she said, "Can you?" And she opened it like randomly to an article, and she said, "Can you read this?" And I looked at it, and it was upside down, so I turned it right side up, and I said, "Sure." And it was about, you know, teacher-parent cooperation, and about the relationships that you can form with your students and their parents, their families, involve them. And I didn't stumble on any of those words, and I was, I don't know, halfway through the second paragraph when she snatched the magazine out of my hand, put it back on the shelf, looked up at Miss Rice and said, "I'll take her." And off we went. And like I said, I didn't, when I was in about sixth grade when I found out I wasn't a New Year's baby. But God bless Grandma. Otherwise, I would have sat out pretty much the whole year. And I had, but I'm not sure how to phrase this. The first time I ever heard the N-word was on the Sally Jones playground.
Mm-hmm.
And it was directed at me. My nose, was rather wide. Mm-hmm. And so I was called an N-nose. And I didn't know what it meant. Mm-hmm. And I went home and of course, when Mom got home from work, I asked Mother what that meant, and I thought she was going to wash my mouth out with soap. And then she stopped to think, "Well, where did you hear that?" And I said, "Well, some kid on the playground, that's what they called me." And she, "What?" And then she just explained that that's not a good word, and you don't call anyone that word. And she said, "Do you want me to go and speak to the kid, the child?" And I said, "No, that's all right. I said, I just didn't know what it meant, but now I know it's a bad word, so I won't use it. Okay, we're fine." At any rate, it was years later when it hit me that I don't know, why would they, but I mean, like I said, Sally Jones had a lot of redneck little kids, and I wouldn't say that I had quickly become teacher's pet, but some of the kids, I mean, they were not good readers. And so they thought I was showing off, and because I was still reading books that my grandmother loaned me, and then Sally Jones would, I didn't know she was Mrs. Jones. She was just Miss Sally, but she had a whole library of children's books and stuff, and so she had me reading Nancy Drew and stuff like that. She figured that was at least more of a juvenile level than Mary Roberts Reinhardt. It was an interesting place to grow up. I ran across, actually looking up stuff for Sushila Cherian. I'm not sure how she stumbled upon walled gardens or whatever, but I was at a memorial service Friday, actually, for Mrs. Hyman, who had been our across the street neighbor there, and when we sat down, Michael Hamans, who's a local attorney, when we went for the reception, in the fellowship hall afterward, my sister and I sat down at the table that he was at. Well, after we moved out of Wall Gardens, when my dad they had given him word that we needed to vacate because they were getting ready to tear it down, and Dad didn't tell us that. In fact, he didn't tell anyway, but he quickly found us another place to live, which was another kind of sort of magical place. It was more rustic, but it was Peace River Lodge. It had been built in 1884. It was right on the river up in Cleveland. It had been built as a hotel. It had 20 bedrooms and 10 baths upstairs. It was on an acre. It was okay, different lifestyle, but in its own way, just as impressive as Walled Gardens was. So I didn't miss Walled Gardens that much until it was after Hurricane Donna hit. But the thing is, when Marla and I walked up to the table in the fellowship hall there and asked if we could crash their table, which we did, there were 6 open seats. But Sushila and Michael had been talking about Walled Gardens. I had known this, I'd found out years before, but I wasn't sure when Michael's family had lived there. And it turns out that they needed a quick place just for a short time. And they had ended up moving into Walled Gardens after we moved out. And they were living in Walled Gardens when Hurricane Donna hit, which was in September 1960. By then, we were out at Peace River Lodge. But Sushila was asking Michael all of these questions. Well, he's 2 years younger than I am. So when I sat down, he looked kind of relieved. He says, "You need to talk to Lynn because she's actually researched this, and her family lived there too." So I've been looking stuff up for Sushila, and I ran across, and this goes back to when I was the archives attendant for the county. One of the gifts that were donated to the county were over 200 bound volumes of old Punta Gorda Heralds and Charlotte Sons, ranging. It was not all inclusive, but the oldest PG Heralds dated from the 1920s, and it went through, I think, the 1980s, and they've been donated by Suncoast Media Group, and I had the chore and the pleasure of going through, of cataloging these, and I did the accession work on them, and after that, when we had public inquiries for certain topics, if they had a date, and if it was a notable event, because at that point the Inglewood Archives had not opened, so all of these bound volumes were in the workroom at Gray Street. The Historical Center on Bayshore Road had been torn down by then, and they moved us into the old health department, which was great. The workroom, which was, I used to laugh that I had the biggest office of all, had actually been the auditorium for the health department, and it was 800 square feet. And that's where all the bound volumes were kept. Our reference library covered a whole wall. I had work tables galore, and I could leave stuff out overnight to work on. But as I was going through the old papers, I would photograph articles. And the ones that were of personal interest to me, I would send home. So I'm looking just night before last, through my digital files for stuff about Walled Gardens, and I found one. It was from the January 1st, 1960, because it had just turned from, yes. So January 1st, 1960 issue of the Punta Gorda Herald, and it was a little social item, went on about 4 or 5 paragraphs, about the Belk-Lindsay employee Christmas party, which had been held at the home of Mrs. Charles Harrell at Walled Garden. We had a 14-foot Christmas tree in the parlor. There was, I thought I knew the ceilings were tall, but I never realized they were that tall. I thought they looked so tall because I was a little kid. But John Allen was one of the first hired. The second among the early on hires was Julia Hamilton, a very charming black woman who had, she was a seamstress, and in those days, the higher department stores are more upscale. If you bought something, like man's suit, whatever, or a cocktail dress or whatever, some, upscale stuff. And it didn't quite fit, they would alter it for you. And there was no charge for that. But that meant they had to have a seamstress on site. So Julia was the seamstress. After my grandparents moved down from Bradenton, Grandma filled in, as part-time, and especially around prom time or, and, but Julia, I remember when her daughter was born, and it was funny. My dad named me and my sisters. My mother was sure that every one of us was going to be a boy, and she claimed the right. She was going to do the naming if for the boys. Daddy got to name the girls. Well, we had 3 girls in the family. That was it. So Daddy named us all. My oldest sister's name was Shirley Marlene, which she never went by. She was always Tony. The nurses in the in the obstetrics ward had named her because she was born with like a full head of black hair and looked like a little Italian dude, they said. And she turned into a just bright auburn, copper penny red hair, at any rate, the middle sister, Marla, Tony's now passed away. Marla's middle name is Dean, so we had Shirley Marlene, Marla Dean, and I'm Lynn Ann. And I'm not sure what happened. Did we run out of syllables or whatever? Anyway, Miss Julia, she was actually Mrs. Hamilton. Everybody called her Miss Julia, or I did. That was, wasn't sure what to name her baby girl. And so she asked Mother. And Mom said, well, I don't know. Chuck named our girls. And Julia laughed, and so she asked my dad. And says, what would you name my baby girl? He thought a minute. He says, how about Derry Darlene? Well, Derry Darlene Hamilton she was. And so, which kind of sort of made her family. And years later, I had not seen her for years, but a mutual friend came by my house. I used to live over on Lake Emma. And they had this young black woman in tow, and oh, you've got to meet this girl. She's from here too. I know you grew up here. Yeah. And I'm trying to get a look at this girl. I'm kind of, trying to look around, at my friend there. And anyway, and I spotted her. I said, well, it's Derry Darlene Hamilton, and what? Anyway, so Derry actually shoved the gal out of the way, and she said, do I know you? I said, you know Chuck and Lee Harrell? And well, yeah. I said, I'm Lynn. Oh my God, at any rate, because it was Old Home Week again. It just, I don't know, or like Groundhog Day. Things just kept coming back, and I ended up working for Derry for a while. That was interesting. She I was a bail bondsman and had other enterprises going on the side. But anyway, but school was weird. By the time of course, Sally Jones, was pearly white. The black kids went to Baker, but by the time middle school came around, was kind of coincided with integration. They had already integrated, I think it was senior and junior, with a select group of students. Gertha Haddock was the first that I had met, because I signed up for theater work, and she was, so that was something that Gertha was into. And I had braces on my teeth. I had, so I was not trying out for anything like that. I painted scenery and everything, but Gertha and I kind of hit it off, and then by that time we'd moved to we were living in Harbor Heights, so I kind of lost track of what was going on here except for school. And my sister Marla was class of '66. I was class of '70, so it was all over. I never believed we caught one of them boys and hung him out the window of the 3rd floor. I don't think that really happened. But I do know that those rednecks had grown up too, and they like to talk big. I mean, back then, my God, every other car in the student parking lot was a pickup truck with a shotgun in the back windshield,
Could you talk more about that window story? What was the story?
I'm sorry?
What was the story about someone out the window?
Oh, it allegedly happened at Charlotte High School, the year that they integrated. But one of the reasons why I don't believe it happened is because at least 5 or 6 different boys claimed that they were the one that dangled the black kid out of the window. And not one of them, they were all, from, I shouldn't keep saying redneck, but rural families. And they were the ones with the shotguns, in the back window of their pickup trucks. But in all the versions of that story that went around, not once could anyone name the boy who got dangled out of the window. And I thought there were only 5 or 6 students that, got rescued from going to Dunbar and went to Charlotte High. Charlotte High was not the first school in Florida to integrate, by the way. Sometimes that rumor goes around too. I think they might have been second or possibly third. I think Dade County was first, but I have to look that up. But that's why I know there might have been, some slurs here and there and some snubbing going on, but I don't think there was any real violence or, the sheriff's office never got called in. For one thing, everybody who went to Charlotte High was local. So we knew each other's families. We knew the school might not have been integrated, but this neighborhood was. Mm-hmm. And particularly here, on the east side. But we had I was class of 1970. And that wasn't that many years past integration. But we already had, like the class officers, they were integrated boards. We had a couple of black cheerleaders, on the thespians, the theatrical productions that they did. If the role could be done by, a black boy or a girl, they were welcome to try out. And if they were the best, they got the role. The band, of course, that integrated right away. The football team, definitely. But also, and baseball and basketball. But the golf team and the tennis I mean, it was all, I can't say it was one big happy family, but it was not a big deal.
So all these clubs and like technical organizations were integrated. Would you say that Charlotte High was like socially integrated? Were people hanging out in integrated groups?
Well, I don't know about, I guess it might have depended on which group you hung out with. But I remember partying down with Tommy Fulton. They going to, and you know, of course, by the time I was a senior, you know, Gertha had graduated, and of course, you know, Calvin and Ellison Haddock, or, you know, that. But Ellison is a preacher now, at, you know, Reverend, and you know, which I would never have, you know, pictured him, you know, back in high school, that he would become, you know, the Reverend Haddock. But he fills those shoes very well. He's, of course, that was his upbringing too. There was a little bit of mixing in the churches, actually, but not so much. And I think this is going to sound kind of weird, maybe, but I think one thing that happened, why the, you know, the bonding or the melding, I guess would be a little better term, was because of the influx of the Northerners, Punta Gorda Isles, for example, on this way. I mean, they were mostly retired military, officer level and everything, and they kind of looked down on the old towners. You know, we were a bunch of hicks. And I think that had part to do. It was like we united the East Side against them damn Yankees. I shouldn't have said that. But, well, and the same with, because Port Charlotte didn't have a high school then either. Mm-hmm. And most of the kids that lived in Port Charlotte, of course, they were Northern transplants. And now the Port Charlotte also was heavily military retiree, but of, you know, the rank and file. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't find any 4-star generals retiring and living in Port Charlotte. They had not yet opened up Grassy Point, and the sections of Port Charlotte that were actually right along, like Harbor Front. Mm-hmm. You know, they saved the best for last. They could get higher prices that way for those lots.
Now, among the Old Towners and/or the Northern transplants, was there ever any organized white nationalist group like the KKK?
There was a KKK, whatever they call them, Clavern or something like that. Anyway, let's say chapter. In fact, when working at the Gray Street facility there, we also had quite a slew of old city directories. And I remember going through one afternoon, and I forget what year it was. You know, but the city directories, you know, you could cross-reference in them because it had the, you know, alphabetical listings of, you know, people and businesses, and then you could go by street address, and then, you know, and it would tell you, if you knew the house number, you know, who lived where, and of course the cross streets were mentioned. So, and then by phone number, and so this must have been one from, I want to say, maybe the 40s. And the KKK actually had their own building on Taylor. um, very close to near where the health department had been built, which was on Grace Street, but off of Taylor. And that blew me away because maybe it was in the 50s. Because I remember, my gosh, I mean, we were living here then, and I was totally unaware that there was a KKK chapter in Punta Gorda, Charlotte County. I'm not sure how large a group it was. Scott Shively has studied that. I don't know if he's, of course not from here, but he's on the board of the Blanchard House. And he could address that aspect because he's done a lot of research into it.
Do you know if that building is still standing and it's just been replaced?
It's not.
Okay.
I was trying to figure out if it was or not, and it's not. I think it was one that we lost in Hurricane Donna, which was 1960. A lot of gaps in that area still. A lot of gaps on the east side still. There were and I have to wonder about the earlier days too. The walled garden had been built in the 1920s. William Knight, Billy, they called him, of course. He was one of the principals of the Punta Gorda Fish Company, which made lots of money at that time. He married Mary Kathleen Smith, who was the daughter of Baker Smith. H.W. Smith built the arcade building that's right across from the post office now. It's been restored. Anyway, so the Smiths had money. The Knight family had money. In fact, Joel and Jesse Knight, back in the 1860s, were among the first settlers in this area. They were brothers. And Joel Knight settled in Charlotte Harbor. And his brother Jesse farther north. He was like Venice and Inglewood area. But anyway, the thing about walled garden is Billy Knight had it was their dream home. When he and Mary Smith got married. And they didn't build it right off, but they built they'd been married about 5 years or so and they had a little boy when Billy Knight was diagnosed with cancer. Well, he was a veteran in the only veterans hospital, well, actually still in this area. It was in Tampa. He died in Tampa. He was only 32 years old. He never got to live in his dream house. But she, I don't know, 6-7 years later, she remarried. And this is not pertinent to our thing here, except for he was a yachtsman. He mostly went by his initials, although his name was Edward, but he went by his initials, E.W.C. Arnold. He was then the president of the Arnold and Constable Company in New York City. Arnold Constable had been the first department store to open in New York City. And by the time E.W.C., his grandfather had started, Arnold Constable. So I'm thinking that's where a lot of the embellishments went on the grounds there. The fancy fountains and the wrought iron, trim work on the front of the house and all of that. But one thing that I had asked about when we moved in, there was a 2-room cabin. I mean, you could call it cottage, but it was more of a cabin type. It had It did have a little bathroom in it and a kitchen sink, a small kitchen sink. And, and I was like, ooh, what is that? Why would they build that? Whose house was that? And my dad said, that's your playhouse. And I thought, cool. And it wasn't until a few years later I thought they had servants. And I don't know why that floored me to think that, because I know that there were wealthy people who lived in Punta Gorda in the early days, but to have servants' quarters, I mean, the whole setup with the red brick wall and all of that was kind of unique. But there were a lot more big, impressive houses on the east side than there are now. The Freeman House, which is, you see it when you come across the bridge, to the south. The Queen Anne or Victorian, they argue over the style sometimes. That originated on the east side. It was on the corner of Booth, which was where Walled Gardens was, and East Marion Avenue. And it had been turned into a funeral home, and the owners decided that they needed a modern facility, and they were going to tear it down. And it was a beautiful house, it still is. And there was some neighborhood outcry, because by that time it was the fanciest house left on the east side. And so Ed Ponger, who'd opened Ponger's Funeral Home, he actually had it, jacked up and cradled and moved to the back of the property and offered it for free to anyone who would take it. And they built their new facility in front of it. And I always wonder if the group that got it, moved it, restored it, was it was the forerunner to the Charlotte Community Foundation. It was the Medical Center Foundation. And I was petty enough, I guess, to think, well, it's about time you did something besides tear these old houses down. And I know that was an uncharitable thought, but when you saw, or I wish you could see, some of the places that were in the east side. And I know that most of them were not owned by blacks, but some of them were. And Gallman's house was a big 2-story. It was very nice, and it rivaled anything over on the west side. And I don't know. But that's why I became a preservationist, and I didn't even know it.
Going back, what are some of your earlier memories of being conscious of race, Because when you're so young, it kind of seems like nothing. What are some of those incidents where you realized that you were white and someone else was black and that it meant something?
Well, it was after first grade. And because John Allen and Julia Hamilton and their families, we became family friends. And so it was not unusual, to John Allen used to take me places, after school events, stuff like that. And I never thought anything. It got some weird looks sometimes, but and the other way around too. We when Derry was little, 3-4 years old, and not just an infant, but we would, it's not that we had play dates or anything like that, but Belle Clincy had a lot of family outings. We would go out to Cecil Webb Game Preserve. There was, at that point, you could ride horses there, barbecue pits, the whole thing. And Belk's would have gatherings out there. So but in town, there wasn't that much, social mixing. Belk's, I don't know, Belk's, it was in its own shopping center, which was, but their customer base was mixed. I'm not sure about, there was a Bell's department store, which I guess would have been the main competitor, whatever, that had opened in the Punta Gorda Mall. And I don't recall seeing very many black employees in the stores in the Punta Gorda. I mean, there must have been some, or customers. It was almost like the highway was the divider then. And I had scooted out of town. Actually, I lived out off Airport Road. They, when I was old enough to have my own place. But it was, so there was still, but it wasn't so much an us versus them kind of, there wasn't that much of a division. But it seemed like on the east side, it was more integrated. I don't know what other word to use. Well, maybe because the hospital was on this side, and they hired, anybody who had the training, basically. But a lot of the other, businesses around here, I'm trying to think of it, because there were several stores. There was a little grocery store on the corner of Olympia and Cochran, which is now MLK, the Olympia Grocery, and that they served blacks and whites. Usually on the way home, though, we stopped at from school. This was before Marla got her driver's license. But we would stop at, I can't think of the family's name that owned it. It's still a convenience store on Cooper Street, right at the end of where Ida Ave. We got to do a dog leg to get across Mary Street and Cooper. But we'd stop and get blue popsicles. I remember that. But I can't think of the family name that owned it. But that, oddly enough, was mostly white. But then the owners were kind of country things. That might have had something to do with it.
Can you remember as integration began to increase, if there was any tensions or blowouts or anything in Punta Gorda? Any confrontations that you heard about?
I heard about a couple, but the ones they would be like at away games for football games and stuff, and and it was usually people at the opposing school, and they would get all nasty mouthed and stuff when our players and the cheerleaders would, because we had when they were getting on the buses and stuff, and but then it was kind of us and versus them. But in this case, we were That's it. It wasn't the whites versus blacks. It was, although it seemed to be the rival schools, it was the white players, and who were mostly against our integrated teams. And so I'm not sure when Lee County, integrated, or actually the other counties that we played.
Do you remember if social events at school like prom and homecoming, were they integrated as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm not sure how many years it took to get a black prom queen or king. But we did have, by 1970, when it came to, because of course, the prom queen and stuff, that was different royalty than like being named, Miss Charlotte High School. That was separate. And we did have a couple of black candidates because they were sponsored by different clubs, the candidates for Miss Charlotte High. And it wasn't, the popularity thing like, homecoming queen was. I got nominated one year. I don't even remember. Oh, Future Homemakers. I can't cook for squat. I used to, but I've been divorced many years. It's micro meals for me.
Okay. Well, do you have anything else that you feel like you should add to the conversation?
There were so many things that I wanted to tell you about, and now I'm ransacking my brain, and I can't think of a lot of it. I think one of the reasons why I was, colorblind, from a very young age. Although I was born at Sarasota Memorial, but we actually lived in Bradenton. My mom and dad, they had their own business. They made candy. Harrell's Candy Kitchen was on Main Street in Sarasota, and Mom was closer to Sarasota Hospital when she went into labor than the Bradenton. At any rate, so that was it. But my grandmother, when Granddad retired, they moved down to. I was born after the Great Migration. My parents, my grandparents, my two older sisters, they were all born in Indiana. So I was the first of the generation of our Florida family. And Grandma and Grandpa moved down, and this was my mother's parents. And Grandma, shortly after I was born, actually, and that's why I spent so much time with my grandmother. Well, along with it, she had retired. She had been a professional seamstress, but she baked the best pies. Her banana bread was kick-ass too. But she got a part-time job, and I would go with her, and she baked at her house. But Circus Hall of Fame was right next to the Ringling Museums and stuff on US 41 in Sarasota. And she would bake pies for their commissary. And she would bake at home, and I would go with her to deliver them. And then she would stay through because their commissary was for the performers. They actually had circus performers, they gave regular shows. And they were not a traveling circus. But the commissary was open to the public, too. And so through the peak lunchtime and early afternoon, Grandma would stay, and she would serve up her pies and stuff, and I would hang out with the performers and their kids and everything. And you know, the circus families are all colors, all nationalities. And my mama dressed me funny. What can I say? But I became Flossie the clown. I was the littlest clown, and I've got photo evidence of this, and some faint memories. But the thing is, I was used to hanging out with, you know, black kids, brown kids, yellow kids, and white kids, you know. But I think that's why, you know, I probably got laughed at a lot, like when I was hauling my Antoinette around by the hand, introducing her as family. But at least people were polite enough, you know, not to, you know, make an issue of it. And it must have been weird. But at any rate, for years, I still, you know, John Allen would tease me, and I would, you know, greet him with, "Daddy John, how have you been?" But there were, it was just, I guess it was the way we were brought up. You know, I mean, I was aware too, when I would go into some of the stores, you know, on the east side there, and they would, you know, keep an eye on me. And when I mentioned that to Mom once, because she'd sent me in looking for something or other, I don't know, at one of the dress shops. And when I came out, I said, "Mom, I can't believe the way, you know, the gal followed me around." And she says, well, she probably thought you were a shoplifter. I thought, I look like a shoplifter? What? But I had seen that happen in other stores when, you know, a black couple would come in, or a couple of black teenagers would come in, and it was like the clerks at the store were on automatic alert. And I thought, why? You know, those gals are no more likely, you know, to pick anything up and stick it in their purse, their pants, or their pockets, or whatever, than I am. And I wouldn't do that. Good God. You know, the great gods above Lindsay would roast me, you know, when I started college at Manatee in Bradenton, I did not use my mother as a reference. I didn't, which I think kind of ticked her off a little. But I got the job on my own merit, but I applied at the Belk Lindsay in Bradenton, Cortez Plaza, and sportswear. I was selling sportswear. And 2 or 3 months after I had been hired and had started, I got called that you have to take a polygraph exam. And I thought, whoa, they hadn't mentioned that. But, you know, okay. But they tell you ahead of time, you know, we're going to ask you this and this and this and this and that. And one of the questions was, well, 2 questions. 1, have you ever shoplifted from a Belk Lindsay store? 2, have you ever heard of, or do you know anyone who has ever shoplifted from a Belk Lindsay store? Do you know how many shoplifting stories I heard growing up here in Punta Gorda from my mother, from Bob Davis, the manager, from John Allen? I mean, he once had somebody come in and try to take a whole box of merchandise out of the stock room, you know. And it's like, where are you going with that? Oh, I'm taking it up front. That's my job. I'll take it up front. You know, where is it supposed to go? And they vamoosed out the back door. So, I mean, John was pretty impressive in size and everything. But by the time I was asked that second shoplifting question, I guess my heart was beating a little, because all I could say was yes. And sure enough, but they don't ask for
the details.
Yeah, and so it was only, and we went down there. So then when, I don't know if they print out tapes or whatever, how they do the readings, but I guess, it had jumped, the needle that was recording the things. And so I was asked to hang around for a little bit because they had some questions. And that was when they discovered that I was part of the Belk family. And I said, I've heard tons of stories about shoplifting, but no, I have never done it myself, and I've never seen anyone do it. But I can tell you lots of stories. And so I think that's why I picked up on how I could go. My best friend, we've been friends for over 40 years now, lives in Washington, D.C. She's born and raised there. We met up there when I moved up there to take a job, and at any rate, but she's black. And she comes down to visit sometimes. And I remember once, I've been back now. I was gone for about 8 years or something, and I came back in late 80s, and Chris has come to visit. Well, first it was annually, then biannually. Now it's maybe every 5 years she can make it down, and we're old ladies now, But we went to one gentleman's house who was known for his porch parties, and of course he was a true Southern gentleman. And it did not occur to me that he would object to me bringing a black woman to his house. And he actually didn't object. It's just when he saw us walking up the sidewalk, he was sitting on his front porch, and I called to him, and he got up, and I know for a fact, had she been white, he would have come out and greeted us, ushered us in, asked if he wanted a cocktail. He was a party person. But no, basically he came out to shoo us off. And I thought, well, you old son of a gun. But I should have known from his age, and his background, and that he was a racist.
And what year was this?
Well, this would have been, say, like 15 years ago, maybe. And of course, when I was younger, I would see things like that, but not really understand that's why, this person was being rude to that person, or I just thought, whoa, what a rude person, because I never saw them in action with their own kind. But that actually surprised me, because it took me off a little, actually. I thought, you don't know who this gal is. I mean, why am I welcome and she's not? And why am I not welcome? Because she's with me. And I think that was, there weren't, Chris never said a word about it. But the next time I saw Bill, I gave him an earful.
All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and end the recording.